So a very warm welcome to you all, and I hope it is warm because I know it's very chilly outside, so many thanks for coming. I think to have such a full room is fantastic, and we have actually got an amazing range of people in the audience, and it's really lovely to see, and it's just fantastic for Mary, I think, to have. And I think a special note that we have got people joining us online, and one of those people is Mary's mum, so who's 82, so that's very lovely. My name is Sally Brown, and I'm Assistant Director here in the Assessment and Research Division, and I head up Cambridge Assessment Network. And for those of you who don't know, Cambridge Assessment Network provides training and CPD opportunities and thought leadership in the practice and principles of assessment, and we sit within the Research Division here at Cambridge Assessment. As I said, it's lovely to see so many people in the room. We also have people live streaming and online. And for those people, if you want to join in the conversation, if you could use the hashtag CamEdLive, which is on the slide at the moment. This is the first of our network series this year, and we don't normally have one in January, but it's lovely that we're having one in January, and we're really delighted to have Mary here joining us. As I said, we provide CPD opportunities and thought leadership, and for those teachers in the room, we were particularly delighted to see that assessment was included as one of the development streams in the launch of the recruitment and retention strategy yesterday, and it's something we welcome very much. A few housekeeping things. If we have a fire, we're not expecting a fire alarm, so if we do get a fire alarm, it's a real one, and we have to go through the fire exits, which will be actually through the reception area where you came in through, and we have to congregate on the playing field of the CAS Centre, which is at Cambridge University Press, just across the road, but we very much hope we don't have to do that. Just one other thing, for those of you who are wearing your badges, if you wouldn't mind handing them back to reception at the end, that would also be really helpful. And in response to some feedback we've got over the past year on running our seminars, we're going to be trialling today Glisser, which is an online question tool. So for those of you who would like to, if you would like to use on your smartphones the URL, which I just have to get up here to find for you. So if you'd like to type in the glisser.it/PT World, it will take you to a site where you will be able to load your questions as you go on, as the seminar is taking place. And we will look at those at the end, and you can also like some questions, and that sort of puts questions up higher up the order, but we'll take questions from the floor as well at the end. So one final thing is we would like you to stay after the seminar as well. We will have drinks and canapes out in the front foyer there, and we'd like you to stay and use that as an opportunity to network with each other and with Mary and the rest of the team that are here today. So please do that. We will, however, have to kick you out at 7:30, otherwise we'll all be spending the night here. So I'm going to hand over to Martin Johnson, who is Senior Researcher here at the Assessment Division, and he's going to introduce our speaker, Mary.
Thank you very much. Is that loud enough? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Real privilege and honour to welcome Mary. She's come all the way from London to share this with us, and it's interesting. We were trying to work out how it was. How long have we known each other? At least 2003. Mary was back was at AQA in those days. We were on a double-decker bus, at least, going to Old Trafford football ground at that stage. So we remember that much. And I was trying to work out what it was about this long-standing sort of keeping in touch, which is why that happened. And it's something to do with the commonalities which bring Mary's work to us in lots of ways. And I think one of them is largely around accessibility and trying to make something which is really complex in terms of assessment sort of accessible to people so that they can understand it better. And I was talking to Mary recently, and she drew my attention to this book which she's just co-authored. And it's something which we try to do here as well, things like the Cambridge approach, but this is really good stuff, and it's really, really important that we're helping to make things understandable, which are actually quite complex things. And that links to another thing which made me think about another link, and that was to do with understanding what it is that people talk about when they're thinking about assessment. So the studies of discourse around assessment, really important. But also importantly, not just what they talk about, what the content is, but how and through what mode that they do that. So, and does that influence how they talk about it? And it reminded me of stuff which we've got on our website currently on the Data Bytes section, which colleagues in ARD worked on, which was looking at tweets around the A-level sort of results day. And the idea that actually you could look at things in terms of the content that comes around at that time, where things shift from good luck being the sort of like first level of conversation, if you like, through to congratulations and other things. But it also, what we don't get through that is perhaps something which I think is a phenomenon about social media, which is this idea of scandal inflation. The idea that, things seem to sort of go extreme. And I think Mary talks a little bit about this in her work. And I think the third thing, which is related to that, is the idea of time and discourse. So the importance of looking at how things change. And Mary was talking to me recently about the way that she's looking at how assessment is represented in things like children's books. And this made me think about some of the work that we're currently doing around the notion of an assessment career. So the idea that how you engage with, how you're affected by assessment from perhaps very young influences your beliefs and your feelings and what you know about assessment. And this is really important that we think about this, just because the whole idea of what is more important, is it what you know, is it your feelings, those things seem to influence each other. And in our post-truth society time, it might be that belief trumps, and this is no pun, belief trumps facts. And if you Google that, it'll turn up all over the place. So I think those were just three areas I thought we have a natural overlap, and it's meant that Mary's work is really current for our work. And the things she's talking about today are so current that they're still in press, in thought, because there's a book that's coming out on this. So we're getting to hear it really, really, really soon. So that's really good. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mary. So thank you very much.
Right, thank you all very much for coming in to put that there, because I'm notoriously clumsy, so I don't want to ruin everything from the outset. Thank you all very much for coming along today and participating, and I hope to get as much out of this as you do. I hope as much that you're interested in what I have to say. This is, as Martin said, it's still work in progress. I'm actually in the middle of writing my very first solo authored book. And a lot of these ideas are very complicated by their very nature, and they are mixed in different disciplines. And I'm going to try and talk my way through some of the issues that I'm covering in the book as I write it. But I'm hoping to have the manuscript ready to go out for publication towards the end of this year. But at the moment, I'm obviously still writing and wrestling with these ideas. As Martin said, I work at UCL Institute of Education. I have the great honour of leading the MA in Educational Assessment that lovely Gordon Stobart helped to found many years ago, and we're still running it, and it's still as popular as ever. So it's an absolute delight and an honour to obviously be teaching new generations about assessment and encouraging people to be interested in assessment, because I think it's an absolutely fascinating subject. And obviously I'm biased, but it's the most fascinating subject in education. I come from a background working in exam boards. So I worked at AQA doing assessment research many moons ago. So I know a lot of people in this room from that time. But now I would say I am stepping onto the other side as well. I do a lot of work in philosophy of education now. And assessment isn't an area that's traditionally had a great link or forged links with philosophy, particularly philosophy of education, which is a very specific paradigm of its own. So I'm trying to use philosophers of education and philosophy of education to help me understand and explore some of the ideas in assessment. And I think we within the assessment community can actually learn an awful lot and use a lot of philosophy to help us become better at our work, to constantly improve our work as we would hope to do so. The one thing I promise you today although the title is Assessment in a Post-Truth World, I will not be mentioning or showing any pictures of Donald, Jacob, or Michael Gove, that is, okay? So you can all rest easy. You will see, though, that I am a very keen advocate, and I do for my department at the IOE manager things like social media. So I have an assessment comment Facebook page where I try to talk about assessment, but I also tweet. And please feel free to follow me, to comment, to give me feedback and ideas. I welcome it all very much. So I'm going to start with a story. And I always talk to my students about this, some of whom find it a bit surprising that I say most of what we do when we're trying to learn about anything, be it statistical, technical in nature, philosophical, we're trying to tell stories about what we know. And this is a true story, and it comes from this document. Now, this is my editing and representation of a document. In 2015, in June, it was a very hot June, I was in Finland, above the Arctic Circle, and I was visiting Santa's post office. Now, there's an educational story behind this. I was leading a big EU-funded project at the time, and we'd done a whole week's work at a university in Lapland. We'd been pulling together strands, and there's a stunning irony in this. Our project was all about how we could help children to feel more European and to understand what it meant to be a European citizen. So I was working with 6 EU partner countries and universities, and we were coming to the culmination of the project. Anyway, on this very warm day, we decided to have the afternoon off, and the locals said, well, let's go to Santa, let's go meet Santa. So off we all went in our shorts and T-shirts to meet Santa. I went into the post office to send some postcards back to England, and I was talking to one of the staff members there, and she said, we've got lots of files from countries around the world. Do you want to look at some of the letters that come in every day from England? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. And she handed me this big sort of photo album, and I began to flip through it. This is an extract from a genuine letter about halfway through the album. And when I read it, I was so taken aback. I asked if I could take a photograph of it, and they didn't seem worried. They said, no, you can have a photo of it. So I obscured the name, and it really haunted me for a long, long time, this idea. It left me wondering several things. First of all, what does it mean for a 15-year-old to be writing to Santa Claus? What worries me about that is the response, because I don't mean it to be a joke. I think there is a genuine concern there of the desperation that comes out of this letter. And I think that's really, really important. Why was this child so stressed? And it was a girl. I could tell it was a girl because of how because of the handwriting. So it had those little hearts instead of the dots over eyes, and I've never come across yet in my career in education of a boy doing that. So I assume this was a girl because the name had been blotted out. But I wondered, what was it that made her so stressed? And I was also intrigued by her aim that it had to be 10 A-star GCSEs. So if this letter was being written now, we'd be aiming for, 10 level 9s or level 8s, but perhaps, they really are a perfectionist. They really want to go for the level 9. And it just got me thinking, is this realistic? Is it truthful? Is it viable? And from this, I started to think more and more. Wherever I seemed to look after that, I started to see things that began helping me to construct a kind of conceptual framing of what it is, what it is that we want from education. What do we want from our assessment? What's a truthful aim? And what's something that can be, that is not attainable, that is perhaps untruthful or distruthful, that's happening out there. And what I started to realise is there are a lot of discourses around this. There are lots of general discourses, but I wasn't sure what the discourses were in assessment. So this is what I've started to compile for the basis of the book. I've started to pull together some ideas about how do people talk about assessment, how do they model it, how do they represent it, what do we understand by it, and how what does it tell us about our society, and what's the truth and what's not the truth, because some of these things aren't necessarily truthful. When we talk about post-truth, the thing that's important to remember is there's lots of recent definitions. And of course, in 2016, it was the Oxford English Dictionary's Word of the Year. And that's because it came into common parlance basically through a certain person in the United States using it an awful lot, and their press office using it an awful lot, and other people talking about that particular political discourse in this way. But essentially, Flood's writing, which is from The Economist, describes it in a way where objective facts are actually less influential than the reality, and where things such as expertise are mocked or derided in some way, or treated with suspicion. And that's a real problem for us. And much as these kind of definitions are important, I think they're only a useful baseline. I think there's a greater complexity behind all of this, and we need to think about it in education in terms of what's truth and what we can see as being trustworthy. It's not a new conception of truth, because I think this is a really important thing. A lot of people talk about saying, well, we're creating these new truths. There's a new conception of it. So sometimes a lie or an alteration of the facts can become a new truth. Well, I don't necessarily believe that either. And I use this example from the wonderful TV series, which if you missed it, you should go home today and get it from Netflix, The Wire, which was on in the late first part of the first decade, of the noughties here. It's an American television series which is in 6 parts. And it's one of those things that it's hard to stop watching it once you watch it. It's so brilliantly written and acted. And it's basically based in Baltimore, and it's around specific themes. Now, in Series 5, this was the one that really stood out to me. And last year we were watching it. You can see I've come to it very late. But there's the most wonderful part where the police in Baltimore are investigating the Baltimore Sun newspaper for false stories. And this is because at one point early on in the series, a homeless man who's had a story written about him, he's a veteran who's had a breakdown and ended up on the streets, comes in and challenges the newspaper's editor. And he says they're making up news. They're making up fake news. So people were using that term, the scriptwriters of The Wire were using the term fake news a long time ago. They're making fake news. You're just doing it to sell newspapers. And the editor of the newspaper challenges him and says, well, that's what we do. There's always going to be errors. There's always going to be, have to reframe the news. It's never going to be exactly right. And as he leaves, this character says, well, no, it's not a side of the story. It's just a lie. And he keeps saying that. And it was interesting that quote really stayed with me, because the scene that follows this is absolutely brilliant. It has the police, a bunch of lawyers, politicians, and all the newspaper people in one room. And there's a lovely point in the scene where they're all telling each other stories about these important political decisions going on around homelessness. And there's a point at which where everyone catches each other's eye and everybody knows that everyone else in the room is lying. And you can just see it. It's so well done. But the important point is that nobody admits that they're lying because the stakes are too high. And nobody admits that mistakes are happening because the stakes are too high. And I think this is a real problem that we have in public discourses. What are the prevailing messages going out there? And how high are the stakes for people? So these are just some of the things I'm going to talk through this afternoon. So you're probably wondering, what on earth is she going to get to education? I am now, honestly. So in terms of educational discourses, the early questions that I started looking at about a year or so ago and that have foregrounded the book, really, and development of the book, are questions about key stakeholders. So if we take this at a very base level, what I'm arguing is that schools, teachers, pupils and employers, how are they expected to believe in the value of educational assessments? If there is so much discourse, which there appears to be, or a lot of discourse around, that challenges the efficacy of these things. And if they're not sure about what they can and cannot believe, then how can they trust educational assessments that fit within the domains within which we produce them, with which we use them, etc. So actually thinking about how we frame these discourses is really important. So from this, I've developed a further series of questions, and these completely underpin each section of the book as I work my way through it. And they're essentially about trying to establish trust. Okay, so I'm not going to read each one out in detail because you can all read. But we're looking at this notion of how can we establish any consensus of trustworthiness? What are the issues of controversy? I'm trying to unpick these and explore them a bit. What are the things that are really problematic for people? And then the last one, which is the really, really thorny one, is what are the implications for developing this going forward? Is it possible to invoke trust and confidence in all assessments? Can we get a real genuine sense of what's going on? So these are my three questions, and I think that they are fundamental in terms of establishing the normative aspects of what we do in the realms of assessment, but they also include quite a lot of empirical content and empirical considerations too, because we have to look at gaps, assumptions, errors, and so forth. And so I think in terms of educational assessment and educational research, this is where I'm starting from. And this is where we have to actually start to decide what is the meaning of some of these things. What do we mean, or what do people mean when they talk about including and developing more rigour, say, in examinations? Does rigour just mean that something is going to get harder? Does it become more exclusive? Is it discriminating better? I'm not sure. I think a lot of the messages that come out of this are very, very confusing. And so I think we have to think about how we actually constitute the truth. And in terms of that, this is where more philosophical thinking comes in. I've been looking across a wide variety of philosophical readings on truth. And I'm starting to feel most comfortable with the form of what is termed as verificationism, really easy one to say. But I think it might be really useful in terms of how we determine the truth in statements that are made about the things we talk about, and how we can use the way that we talk, the way we explain things, to try and really invoke more trust. For those of you who are philosophers, this will be old hat, but for those of you who are new to this realm, one of the things that I always go to consistently, and I've been looking at philosophy of education for a long time now, but the Stanford Encyclopedia always comes up trumps with the best starting points for explaining things. And their discussion of truth as how we verify things is really important, this idea about that it's not a fully objective matter. And I think this maps quite nicely this idea of verificationism onto what we're doing when we're trying to create assessments that are valuable and worth something and that other people find useful. So, how do we actually start to establish some of these ideas and truths? And how do we start to challenge some of the more problematic discourses that are going on? I like a diagram, so I've been trying to model these things. And through my conversations and through looking at a lot of the literature, imagery, and other things that I'm going to show you as we go through the presentation, I've started to model how I think post-truth narratives actually emerge and are sustained within public discourses. And I don't think there's really a starting point to this cycle particularly. I think you can almost come in at any point. But the point I'm trying to make with this, it's a continually self-sustaining narrative. So if you come in at the point of public discourse, and that might be actual discourse that happens in the pub, it might be discourse that happens on social media, it might be discourse that happens in schools, but anywhere where people are talking about an educational matter, you can have elements of confusion because people might add in facts that are incorrect or have some level of error to them, or they may misrepresent them in some way. And I'm going to come on to why people do that in a bit, or why we think people do that in a bit. And that, as far as I can see, kind of really starts to ramp up a level of confusion that then builds very shaky arguments that feed back into very poor ideas to perpetuate falsehood. And that continues to sustain this post-truth narrative. And that feeds back into the public discourse, which is why we keep hearing the same stories come around and again, and why we keep feeling concern and unease about things, because it's a very kind of slow drip effect. And it's a cycle of sustenance, but it's kind of not very good. If you were just to align it in a kind of dietary way, this is a cycle of lots and lots of fast food and far too much sugar, etc., without much fruit and veg coming into it. So it's constantly fast-paced, constantly moving. And within that, there's a whole lot of actors as well, and we have to think, how are we managing all these different actors who are working within this structure? And I think the only way we can really establish trust in what it is that we do and really develop a sense of trustworthiness about assessment and about education is to make sure that we have everybody engaged. And around, circling around this notion of my idea of a kind of a dream trustworthy assessment, I don't know what that is yet, by the way, are all these different actors. So we've obviously got educators, and by that I mean teachers, I mean academics, I mean anyone who has a role of being an educator at different times. Policymakers, we've got families, but we also have, and the big influencers, part of this are the general media. And I'm not talking just about journalists, but I'm also talking about other media streams now because of the kind of very complex ways in which we share news and ideas these days. But we also have the whole industry, and I'm sorry to sort of lump everyone into one thing as an industry, but there is. It's a big industry now around assessment and around the development of assessments. But then all the different phases of schooling also are enacted in this. So it's not a wonder that this is a problematic area, and that actually establishing the truth in all these different situations for all these different people is a very complex endeavour. So it really is dependent on who's using it, how they're using it, where, when, and whether there is any hierarchy involved in that relationship or indeed in those relationships, because there's quite a few of them there, as to how trustworthy or how truthful we are being about it. I was rereading Gordon Stobart's book, Testing Times, recently. And in one of the chapters there, it struck me again that in many respects, kind of sadly, we haven't moved forward. We've moved forward in lots of ways, because the one thing I would agree with Joanne Baird on is that our knowledge and understanding generally of assessments and how assessments work, particularly in schools, is way, way better than it was. Even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it's improved dramatically and it keeps on improving, which is great. But one of the things where we still have a problem is our understanding and our general discussion about how we interpret the results of assessments. It's also a problem when we look at how people contextualise assessment practice, what's going on, how people talk about it, how they understand it or misunderstand it. And we are also living in a time of unsustainable assessment policies, particularly in school level, but I'm also going to talk a bit later on about my own area, which is in higher education too. And that is purely linked to accountability. So accountability measures and the pressure that accountability systems and a culture of accountability are feeding into education. And I think this is an ongoing problem, and one that unless we can actually fundamentally change some of those ideas and those policies, we aren't actually going to shift ideas about what assessment is and what it's for. So we need to step back, and as Baird and Simpson's work from 2013 argues, we have to actually challenge discourses with evidence. One of the biggest problems when we hear something that we're not sure whether it is true or not true, we actually need to look for evidence. And quite often, a lot of the evidence that's presented to people or that circulates in popular realms is not necessarily very good evidence. It's not very strong, and it doesn't help us make decisions about whether something is truthful or trustworthy. Secondly, and I think this is very important, I've talked to Stuart Shaw here about this, these concerns about fairness as well. So whether something is fair and how our perception of fairness has an impact on trust too. That's really critical in terms of assessment, whether or not we believe a result to be fair or the process to be fair, etc. That really does impact our trust. Also, if you haven't read it yet, there's a wonderful book by Jan Macarthur which just came out last year, which is about social justice and assessment, which I really welcome seeing a book like that come into the assessment literature now. And she talks about stakeholders having different views. There's a misalignment of interests in assessment quite often. And of course, this has gone on forever. If we look back in the history of education, the outcomes of our assessments are often misused. We know that assessment is a really good lever for social mobility, but by that very term, it also becomes really good fodder for political point scoring, and I don't think we can extract that from it. And so I come to the philosopher Honora O'Neill to round off this part, because I think the way she encapsulates her thinking and writing about trust and truthfulness in assessment and education is I can't do it better. It's absolutely beautiful. Her writing is beautiful, and the way she talks about it is beautiful. And I think this is a really good aim that she sets in her recent paper from 2016, that it's about focusing on being trustworthy, and I think that's really, really important. And that's about creating usable and understandable evidence to help others trust us. And I think this is part of the way we have to go. We have to keep thinking all the time, how do we talk about our work? How do we talk about assessment? How do we explain it to people? How do we make it meaningful to them? Because the ways that people do perceive it are very odd, and I'm going to just talk through some of the pieces of evidence that I've been collecting in the last couple of years. Because a lot of the evidence I've found is very, very mixed up. We get a huge amount of information now, we can all agree to that, and I don't want to harbour that idea. The problem we have with all the information that we get constantly is establishing what's correct and what's incorrect, and what might be truthful and what might be not truthful. And also thinking about what are the dominant messages that we see and which of those messages really matters. I think a really good example at the moment is talking about migration. Okay, it's a very hot topic at the moment. And it's quite interesting that if I ask the question in this room, what percentage of the population you might think is comprised of foreign-born migrants in England at the moment, we would probably get a good range of answers. We might get reasonably near what's the established truth, but generally, when you do that poll in public situations, just on the street, for example, the research I was reading about this from the Oxford Migration Observation Unit says that most people assume it's about 35%. The actual figure is, at the moment, stands at 14.4%, so almost half what most people make as a rough estimate of migration populations. Why does this matter, you think? Well, I think it matters immensely because it's not only that figure that's the problem, it's also the story that then circulates around this. And it's the words that are used to describe situations that really bother me about this. So people talk about, they use the words sort of, if you'd seen them recently in the paper before Christmas, people flooding to the shores, okay, of England, or there'll be an overrunning when people come in as migrants. Well, that's really interesting because A, when you look at the actual facts, that's not true. But B, it's actually ignoring the truth of the situation. And my argument is the truth of that situation is, why is someone so desperate to put their life at risk in order to, go in a boat where actually they're probably not even quite sure where they're going to? And that's the truth of the argument we're looking at. So it's what I'm actually trying to get at here is thinking about how do we actually get people to think past that first piece of information? How do we get them to challenge information? And this is why it's really problematic for us that once facts are established, even if they're not correct, how do we alter them? How do we correct them again? How do we get the correct information out to people? And I think for us in education, that is a real problem. And that is a real challenge. When misinformation gets out there and is circulating, how do we correct that? Because we don't all get our information from similar places, so we need to find out where people get it from. Now, one of them that Martin mentioned at the beginning is obviously social media. Now, most of us engage with social media. If you look at the national surveys from the government, I was just looking at the statistics last week, and it's over 90% of people engaged now in this country in some kind of social media on a regular basis. Most people still get their news from quite credible news sites, but we get more and more of our news from social media. So we talk about it more in those frameworks and in those environments. And lucky for me, in the linguistics field of education, linguists are now starting to analyse social media and building up corpuses of analysis, which is really helpful. And the top one is actually from a really interesting paper to look at. And I will, after the lecture, I'll make sure that I can circulate a full reference list, by the way, for everyone to, if you want to go away and look things up later on. These are from some linguists in the States who analysed Twitter feeds that were coming out of the White House about a year ago. And they actually analysed them for the terms post-truth and fake news. And they started to look across all these corpuses of interactions going back and forth and looked at how different people position themselves in the argument. And what they found, in many senses, is unsurprising. But it's not something we actually talk about very much. When we talk about social media, we just imagine we're all out there, all interacting. But actually, we're not. When we go out into these forums, we stick very much with our own. We stick in quite small enclaves. So what happens is, as Michaelidis and Viotti are saying, is we keep telling ourselves and each other in our enclave the same story. And the more we tell it, no matter whether it's the truth or not, the more we believe it. But we keep those stories circulating in particular ways. And I think that's actually really important for us to know and for people to be aware of. So if, in certain groupings, this is what's going on, then how are we going to access that? How are we going to change untruths when they're happening in very specific areas like that, particularly if we're not part of that little grouping? But of course, you can go back to philosophy, way, way back. You can go back to the ancient Greeks, if you like. I only went back to 1922 and looked at some of George Conger's work on duality again, because he writes very clearly again about this. And he argues even then, we have to think about what the human condition is. We're very selective when we talk about things. We fix our eye on something and we decide that's the thing we're going to believe in. And we will actually discount generally what's around us because we want to believe that. And it's actually really hard also to change our minds, and this is the problem. And I think Conger's quotation, why I pulled that out and why I think it's important, is it's relevant now to think in that way because in a way we are often so bombarded with information and news. I often feel regularly very overwhelmed, and I love to read a newspaper daily, and I love to skim through news online, etc., and read other newspapers and watch television news and things like that. But then sometimes it is completely overwhelming with the amount of information that you're given, and then it's how do I actually process all that? And it's only some of those views that go in. So also it's how well is this marketed? And this brings me on to what happens in broader public realms of what I think and I claim are imagery that worries me and bothers me. This is a phone box. We're not going to be seeing these for very much longer, are we? On the right-hand side, it's at the bottom of my street. I live in Reading, and I live near a really big secondary comprehensive school. And lots of children walk past this phone box every day to school. I noticed this about 18 months ago, and it stopped me in my tracks because there'd been an advert for something else up there for ages, like shampoo or something. Suddenly this appeared one morning, so I thought, oh, how interesting. What struck me most of all was, obviously, it was aimed at the teenage market because of how the actual advertisement is structured. But then I thought it was really interesting. Okay, it's offering you the Little Blue Book of Sunshine. I thought, okay, it's quite a nice idea, Little Book of Sunshine. But what struck me most of all was the list of things that you need to be worried about. The first thing in that list of things that you might be worried about is exams. Exams, relationships, life, ... Top tips for dealing with it all. If you can't see that, sorry, it's the white text at the bottom of the phone box. That's what it says. Exams, relationships, life. Now, I thought this is very interesting because I thought back, and I might be the only person in the room, okay, who feels like this, but when I was 15 or 16, to be fair, exams would not have been top of my list of things I was so worried about. And it got me thinking, isn't that interesting? That they're offering a book to help you improve your mental health. So I went away and had a look at it, and it's a very well-constructed book. However, what bothers me about this is there any evidence that this is kind of triggering, this is something else you need to be more worried about, or you need to be worried about, or it should be top of your list? And I'm intrigued as to that as a kind of message out there. Just adding some more stress to that whole situation. And it kept me thinking about that letter to Santa again. Some of the imagery around assessments also kind of makes people laugh. But then, again, I don't think it's very funny. I showed this at a conference a few years ago, and lots of people did laugh. So it's quite good today that nobody laughed in the room, unless you were doing it inwardly. If you didn't see this, it's from 2016. It's in Bihar province in India, where the national state tests happen once a year, and they are so high stakes that what was happening by 2016 was as soon as students were turning the paper over, there was, I think the correct story is that there was an ability to bribe invigilators so that students could pass or shout questions out and people could pass answers through the windows to the students so that they could get as higher marks as they could, obviously, and do well in the test, because that's going to impact your life chances. Apparently, the following year, the government spent lots of money to get 70,000 troops and officials in to make sure that people were kept away from the building. Interestingly enough, the pass rate dropped by 70% that year for the exam. But, interestingly enough, in 2018, it went up again, and about 54% of the cohort passed. Okay, so over time, there was no more cheating or anything carrying on, but there was obviously that first big drop, and then we see the pass rate rise again. And there has been a lot of discussion lately, and there's been publications, of course, on concerns about cheating. And, of course, this is prevalent now with modern technologies and the ways in which people are trying to cheat the system. That concerns. Another image that's really popular is this kind of image. This is the one we all recognise. We're short on news in August, so out come the exam results, and what do we see? Loads of leaping girls, sometimes boys, but not so many boys. Girls tend to do more leaping. It's quite interesting. For years, every day when the GCSE and A-level results come out, I go and buy all of the newspapers in my local shop, and I just take out all the images and have a look at them, and I look at the way it's all reported. And I knew it would come in useful one time, so it is going into. But I'm really interested in this representation of exams because it also, in terms of high stakes exams, it also is at odds with a lot of the discourse that goes on at that time too. Once people start interrogating the minutiae of the results, because then it's kind of, we often see the leaping girls then positioned against headlines that say, well, of course, A-levels are much easier than they were in my day, or, GCSEs lack rigour, etc. And so with one hand, we are saying, yay, brilliant, go on, leap in the air, you've done amazingly well, and then pulling away with the other to say, no, this system is not trustworthy, you should be suspicious of it. And that really does bother me, because, again, that smacks of the duality that Conga was so concerned about and that I am concerned about. It's a very poorly evidenced way of arguing and discussing something that is so important. And it is so important that it also, as Martin alluded to, it also links into children's literature now. The Americans produce lots of literature, and I've been collecting books related to testing and assessment. Gosh, you can see how the hours fly by in my house, can't you? I've been collecting them for quite some time now. The Americans have most of them, and I just pulled two out because these two are very interesting. The first one is to do with the SAT test. So children, it's about a little boy preparing for the SAT test and what he needs to do, and he's very concerned about it. And it starts with him being told stories about how scary the test-taking process is. And then, of course, he takes the test. He does it. It's not too bad, but at the end his little sister said, how is it? And he starts to retell the stories he was told at the end back to her. And I was kind of quite disappointed when I got to the end. It's like, oh, okay, so you're just perpetuating that horror story year on year. The other one is very interesting, and this has only come out in the last couple of years. And Julia Cook has written this series of books about the Anti-Test Anxiety Society, ways to prepare for testing in schools. And these are available both in America for elementary and for high school too. And there are actual clubs that you can join and say you are a member of the Anti-Test Anxiety Society, and there's quite a lot of marketing ephemera that go with this too. Again, they're books that are widely available, are popular in schools, because I've spoken to children's literature groups online and asked people to help me source these things. And again, they said these are the kind of most popular imagery that is in there. So children describing how they feel, talking about how they feel, and then down at the bottom there's quite a lot of guidance on here's how you can prepare. Make sure you have a good breakfast, make sure you sleep well, make sure you've got a box of tissues with you. I wasn't quite sure about that. Were you going to cry a lot when you're in the exam room? That worried me quite a bit, you know. And don't worry. And so I'm continually, you know, looking at these and collecting them, and I have been talking with children's literature specialists about how to actually kind of, do some analysis of the kind of discourses that happen in these books too, because again they're all passing on particular messages to young people, and I think it's worth us thinking about what that means. You might think I'm over-egging it, but I do think that's important, because in England also, we don't have as much of a history of a culture of this, but what I find most interesting is if you go into, say, W.H. Smith's or to a large supermarket, have a good look if they've got a big area of magazines and newspapers. When you go to the children's area, you'll find the kind of pink and purple bit for girls, and then you'll find the next bit for boys, and they are unfortunately partitioned in that way. What you will find now, the most sizable part of those will be study guides, revision guides, more guides to do with practicing for tests, etc. And again, so that's seeping into the kind of public psyche of not only are you going to go and pick up a copy of the Times or the Mail or the Guardian or whatever, but you might also pick up a revision guide while you're there. That's part of something you can buy off the shelf. I have to say what's interesting about the UK's images of assessment in literature is that there's no, I couldn't find any picture books, and no one could point me to any picture books through the children's literature sources. But books for preteens, this book called The Wind Singer is absolutely a wonderful story, but it starts with a young girl who has to take a test, and the entire society is built on one test that all the children take on one day, and it decides where you'll live, what colour clothes you wear, what house you'll live in, and what job you do. And so the protagonist in this book decides she's going to fight back against the results of the test, and so the story unfolds, and it's very interesting. It turns into a trilogy. but that it's also, you can see the influences. It's very well nuanced the way it's written. The other two books are to do with linking and preparing for GCSEs and for A-levels too. So they also contain content where people are waiting for results, where people are discussing their life course and options and choices about life as they go forward. So again, there's less in the UK, but what's interesting with it, and I was talking to Martin about this the other week, is the timing of it. All of the literature in the past, your Enid Blyton, Mallory Towers, those kind of boarding school books that talked about prepping for the school cert, really popular. And I loved reading them as a girl, but they're all written at a particular time. Most of the writing of all of that kind of block of literature finished 1950s, kind of mid-1950s. And then we don't have much literature after that, focusing on any kind of examinations, until about, I think Tyler came out in the early 1990s, late 80s. So I may be wrong about this, but I feel that there's obviously a link to do with what people are seeing, the change that people are seeing in school, and then how that starts to be reflected from there on. And it does tell a story, and I think Harry Torrance's recent paper on this encapsulates this beautifully. And this really does bother me, because everyone in this room will have an educational story. We all have some backstory as to what we felt about a particular result we got. But what we know for sure is that it defines us as an individual. We are defined by particular assessments as successes or failures. And what we also know is that then legitimizes a culture in which our success or failure then impacts our life chances. And we do know that happens. But we actually do need to talk about it more, and we need to talk openly about why that happens too. I think there does need to be more honesty about that. But that obviously is a deeply political discourse that we're having to look at here. The other thing that I have, moving on to the next chapter in the book, that I'm discussing, and it's something I've talked with Paul Newton about too, is the concept of error. Because, of course, Paul has been writing about this for quite a long time. But I'm really interested in thinking about how we talk publicly about error and how we talk publicly about mistakes that happen in relation to the assessments, because they happen. But we're not very good about talking about mistakes. And I've been trying to collate other paradigms where we can make comparisons and say, well, okay, what would they do? And how could we transfer some of these ideas into the way we talk about error in assessment? The journalist, he was a Guardian journalist, Nick Davis, wrote a fantastic book called Flat Earth News that came out in 2009. And he was writing about fake news a long time before it became common parlance. And he said, of course, what happened was when all the major newspapers stopped being owned by kind of these individual moguls and became massive corporations, he said, our jobs changed. And he said, in some respects, they changed for the good. But also what happened was we had the commercial pressure upon us. And he said the problem was that as our work became more automated and much more pressured, we were tethered to tighter and tighter deadlines. And he said, of course, that meant the time allowed for doing research, for collating evidence, for testing, for checking, but became shorter and shorter. And he said it's inevitable. News goes out with errors in it. It gets compromised by errors. And he said, but what we have to do is be honest about those. I suppose what bothers me is errors do happen in news, and we can probably all think of some of those now, but how well are they corrected? And then how well are they believed after that? I think this is the other part of the problem. Do we actually believe the new news when it's actually presented to us? And I think how journalists deal with that is deeply problematic. And I have been interviewing some of the leading educational journalists in this country and talking to them about how do you represent education, and why, when you wrote X story, why did you write it like that? And usually the response is, because I need to get a story. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying about The Wire earlier, and I'm not trying to be cynical about it, but they're also quite honest. I have to write a story in a particular way in order to actually get it out there, and that's partly what news is about. The other example I was looking at was medicine. And again, error in medicine is obviously is very well known. It's something we talk about a lot. One of the things that is very hot topic in research at the moment, but has been being discussed since the 1970s, is the so-called weekend effect. So it's basically known that if you are taken into hospital at the weekend, particularly with a very serious accident or illness, your chances are severely compromised in terms of care, and the chances of an error happening at some point in your treatment are much higher than they are during the week. So the question from this comes then, what kind of levels of error are acceptable when it comes to health? If we accept that that is going to happen, I was discussing this a while ago with Isabel Nisbet, because she sits on one of the ethics committees in the Department of Health and discusses these issues. And she said, well, we can ask the question, what if it's someone in my family? What does, how does that change my perception? Well, I actually had this challenge 2 years ago. Someone very close to me was in a car accident that wasn't caused by them and was taken to hospital on a Friday. They seemed to be doing very well, but were supposed to be monitored over the weekend for blood thinning because of potential clots. 3 doctors in a row did not test them, and on the Sunday they had a massive heart attack which resulted in severe brain damage. Now, if someone had just been able to give that injection at the right time, it's likely that would never have happened. So that person now has gone from living a reasonably healthy life, being outgoing, they were retired, but living a reasonably healthy life, to now being very incapacitated, unable to read and write, and unable to do a lot of things for themselves. And it's an interesting question when it happens to you, because the interesting thing was there was a legal case, but the legal case was held against the person who caused the first accident because it was an industrial vehicle. And there was the potential to have a legal case against the NHS, but our family chose not to do that. The person in charge chose not to do that. Then they had the option, because they didn't feel it was appropriate to go that next step. And their argument was, someone just made a mistake. Well, one thinks, wow, what a mistake. That's a huge mistake to make with somebody's life. But equally, it's also taught me a lot about thinking, well, yes, the reality is it's a mistake that someone made. There was no intention behind that. It just happened. But it's interesting how we will package up different levels of error in this way. So when it comes to assessments, how are we going to deal with error here? It appears, according to some research, and there's lots of different bits of research from all over the place that I've gathered together for this, but I chose this one as an example today. The Student Room website from 2017 did a survey, and they had just shy of 1,500 respondents there, you can see. Of those, only 200 said that they had any trust in the exam system. Now, okay, it's a very small survey, and of course it's bound to be biased in lots of ways. But it's interesting that they wrote this article looking at social media, looking at the influence of popular press on how students talked about and felt about their examination results. The kind of dialogue and discourse that goes around it, people claiming that the exam board didn't stick to a specification, people claiming that questions are included that are irrelevant or pointless or not correct for them. Well, it's interesting because within, obviously, the culture of awarding bodies and boards, we know that that's not the truth in that sense. People don't go out intentionally to try and ruin candidates' lives. They don't go out to not include what's in a specification. But this is the perception, and what happens then is it's these kind of discourses that concern me most of all, because they move very fast and they spread very wide. And one of the next things I plan to do is actually talk to social media strategists within awarding bodies about how they manage that discourse. Because I don't know how you take back those discourses. You know, I can only do it one by one. I'm sure most people in this room have had dinner party conversations where you've made the mistake of telling someone that you work at an awarding body or a regulator or somewhere, and then people start going, well. And you have to one by one say, well, actually, it's not quite that simple, or no, it doesn't mean A-levels are easy, and, are easier now than they were in whatever it was, 1904, when you took them or whatever. It's those kind of arguments, this notion of duality, and that's what bothers me. But it comes back to that legacy. That's what bothers me. These kind of arguments are dual in their nature, and they come back to Torrance's idea about legitimating this idea that that's made a statement, that that's it, everything's ruined now from here on. This doesn't count. So, coming to the final bit now, and trying to look forward and think about the implications of new technologies and these new realms of discourse. You know, we've got this sun rising on these amazing ways that we can communicate. And I, for one, am a very keen advocate of using social media, of using different ways to find information. Because as a researcher, I think it's tremendous now that I can tweet out, anyone know any good papers on X, Y, or Z, and within the day get back loads and loads of ideas and suggestions from other colleagues within research terms. That's a fantastic option. However, the speed at which one does that and the way at which one does that, it's a double-edged sword, as we said. And also, we know there's a lot of new technologies that are really helpful in terms of, enabling cheating, and that's a problem. So, the example I'm going to give here is going into my own realm of thinking about new technologies. I've been doing some research for the past 18 months from IOE, but with academics in a range of 20 different HEIs, or higher education institutions across England, about the introduction of electronic marking for undergraduate and master's students. There is software available now. It's linked to the plagiarism softwares that are available across all universities. And most academics are now expected to mark using electronic tools. The interesting side to this is that every single person I've interviewed and surveyed about this has never had any training or discussion of any kind within their institution about the shift from paper to screen. And a lot of the arguments that one hears or sees in universities with regards to the change to electronic marking emphasise things like convenience. So they say things like, well, it's much easier for students. They can just upload the work. They can download the work. They don't have to read your terrible handwriting because you've typed all the comments in, or you've made an audio feedback commentary on their piece of work. As far as I'm concerned, that's about convenience and it's about efficiency. But that's not about pedagogy, it's not about learning, and it's not about helping my students be assessed well to actually be educated. And I think this is a real problem, particularly in higher education. I think going forward, it's something that I am aiming to develop further in research, because in schools, of course, electronic versus paper-based assessments has been reviewed and researched for many years now, and we're seeing, really interesting results in the efficacy of it. But there's an assumption, and quite a lot of people have said things like, oh, it's not really any different. Everyone's used to using their phone, so it's fine. They can use a screen instead of marking on a piece of paper. What that shows me is a lack of understanding about the process of that particular process of assessment. You have a very particular relationship with a script as an academic when you're actually marking a script, and teachers do the same. And you can't say that transferring something onto the screen is going to be the same. It cannot be. Just can't be. There may be no difference. What I hope when I do a large-scale comparative study of the two modes, I hope that there isn't much of a difference, but I suspect there might be. And what concerns me in higher education is the institution, a kind of juggernaut of let's get on the technology bandwagon, particularly with electronic marking and electronic feedbacks, is dealing with the large-scale work that we deal with. You know, heaven forbid that anyone ever asks me to examine a PhD on a computer screen. I wouldn't be able to do it. And I'm fairly technically adept. But equally, I can't have a relationship with a PhD page by page on a screen. So again, this is a whole new area of assessment that we need to think about. And the assumption, that's what bothers me, that there's no difference, is extremely problematic. Okay, so I am drawing it to a close now because there's a few things I want to say about what I think we need to think about. When I talk about teachers here, I don't just mean school teachers, I also mean anyone who is educating. And sometimes that's parents, that might be people in colleges, universities, whoever has that role of actually helping someone learn something. But particularly in schools, there is this kind of profound culture of mistrust that's come and gone, but is building strongly again. And I put Holmes up here because if you read that first quotation, this distrust of the teacher was the basis of the policy of the department. So then profound distrust of the child was the basis of policy of the teachers. When I show that to students and say, when do you think that was written? Most of them say, don't know, 80s, 90s, etc. Well, it was written just about the turn of the 19th and 20th century. So I think it's about 1912 that quotation comes from. And I think, goodness me, there's a huge amount has changed in terms of looking at trust. And teachers are losing trust in their profession. And teachers are also losing trust in themselves as well because of how the profession is developing. And unfortunately, a lot of that is the pressure of accountability related to assessment outcomes in certain sectors of education. And if you look across the sector going forward, it's pretty apocalyptic in terms of teacher retention in the coming years. And it is something we should be worried about. But again, it's not talked about. There isn't a public discourse about teachers, apart from the old story that what a great job that is. They go in at 9, come home at 3 and get 2 months off in the summer. You know, that's the discourse of what a teacher is. Would bet people knew what it was actually like. The idea of teachers as professionals has changed, and I think that's really problematic for us in assessment too. Stephen Ball's work, obviously has gone on in this for years, and lots of other people do work on this too, but this constant questioning and challenging of the efficacy and professionalism of the profession, and I still like to call it that, is really important, and it bothers me greatly that people do not see it as such. In particular, its relationship with assessment is problematic too as well, because teachers often are blamed for pupils not doing well. Then they're chastised if pupils do well, that they've helped them too much or made it too easy, etc. So they don't seem to kind of win in this relationship where they are. And so their achievements, again, the student achievements are often misplaced when we look at the discourses and discussions that go on around this. And particularly, say, for example, that report that came out last year about the slight, and it was only a slight increase in teachers cheating to help pupils get particular grades. And I was asked by, I think it was BBC or someone, to do a short interview about it. And so I had a quick look at the figures. And they said, oh, aren't you really surprised and shocked? And I said, no, not really. I said, actually, I'm surprised it's not higher. It doesn't actually look like very many people to me. It was a couple of hundred. And I said, if you put this much pressure on people in this situation, no matter how professional they are, at some point, some people will crack, and that's what will happen. And that's what happens within an accountability system. And I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that's what can happen. So we shouldn't actually be surprised when we distrust people this much, that then people go on and do such things. So, some final thoughts. I believe that if we really, really want to start to encourage greater trust in assessment, then we have to be in it for the long haul. And we have to make that really, really clear to people. This stuff does not happen overnight. And it still amazes me outside of the educational discourse. I probably shouldn't be amazed at all. But outside of the educational discourse, when you talk to people about just how long it takes things to embed, to understand, to learn things, to change, people are going, why can't you do that tomorrow? Why can't you do that next week or in one term? Well, actually, we're very quick to forget how long it takes us to learn things. So we need a long commitment. We also need to take our model from really good quality assessment. So everything we do, every change we make, every policy we invoke, we need to engage fully with it. And we need to encourage people to reflect on it, be willing to change things, be willing to talk about error and talk about what is and what isn't acceptable in terms of error and mistakes, but also help people to understand what that means. It's likely some people are going to be distrustful, and I don't know, I haven't got a solution for any of this, but I haven't got a solution for that one. Some people just will be distrustful. I think that's the way. They'll be in that little social media cohort that keeps going round and around in a very angry way about whatever it is that they're angry about. So I think we have to live with some of that. But I think actually without reframing how we educate and then how we assess things, all of this is problematic. We can't invoke the trust without really helping people to understand what the holistic view of education is, and then within that, how assessment works. We need to kind of break open the secret garden. People wrote about the secret garden in the 1950s and 60s, and I think there still is a big wall around that garden in education even now. And truth. This is the harder one, but thinking about notions of truth. So I think we need to, if we want to be true in terms of helping people understand more about what it is we do, what matters in assessment, and what the key actors are in assessment, is we have to make a commitment to think about how we talk about it, the words we use, how we explain it. We need to also open up communication still. People say, oh, well, the information's out there, it's on a website, there are news broadcasts, etc. I don't think it's enough. It's clearly not enough. And we're still not doing it in the right way because of a lot of the discourses that happen out there. So we need to find other ways. And, that's going to take time. And in doing that, as I say, it's not simply putting it up there and saying, well, we're being transparent, the information is out there, go get it. That's not transparency. That's just providing information. Transparency is actually engaging with it, making a proper commitment to being really truthful so that we invoke that trustworthiness that Honora O'Neill says. I think also it's about trying to help people and educate people that this is a public endeavour. Again, I think it's an age-old issue in education that I finished school, therefore, I'm moving on. I have no interest in that. You may be thinking that this is pie in the sky, kind of a wet liberal thinking. But I think we have to try and keep battering away at this idea of education being a public endeavour because it is so fundamental to the structure of our society and how our society functions. And it does require participation at all levels. And the biggest thing we have to challenge from here on in all sectors is duality. Now, you can't actually, I don't think, see this in great detail, but you'll have the joy of it when if you download the slides. One of the Facebook pages that I subscribe to is called a Nihilism Facebook group, where they have these guinea pigs that talk to each other about different things. And it just so happened the other week that the guinea pigs were discussing duality. And the one on the left said, you're either with us or you're against us. And the other one says, well, what if I don't pick sides, but critically examine both and come to a nuanced, informed, unique opinion? And you can see what the third slide says. Guinea pig can't cope with the nuanced opinion. I'm going to finish now with a quote from my other favourite current contemporary philosopher, who is Nell Noddings, who's written some terrific books on the ethics of care in education and how we consider each other in a culture of care. And I think underpinning any arguments or discussions about truth and trust have to be built on a foundation of care and of responsibility. And as she says, as educators, everyone in this room has a role of some kind that will influence and educate people in some way. And we need to think about our students primarily. It was one thing I was taught at AQA from the word go by Joanne Baird, who was my manager at the time, was she said, whenever you open your awarding pack and you look at those statistics and you look at those figures, remember that every single number is a child. And I've never forgotten that piece of advice, and it's always made me think of that. It's very, very important. Because, as Nell Nodding says, if we just demand accountability, you just get compliance. But what I want us to think about going forward is real thought and the invocation of real trust in what we're doing. Thank you.